24 hours, like 24 hours. That deal is waiting to be done. You gotta settle.
Trump wants to make a deal, but does Putin? Is he gonna negotiate in good faith? Could negotiations blow up in Putin's face? The reality is that Putin is scared of making a big mistake. Today we'll explore what really puts Putin on edge about negotiations with Trump, and it's probably not what you think. When Putin launched his full-scale invasion in February 2022, he claimed he did it to denazify Ukraine, to make sure Ukraine was never going to be in NATO, and to demilitarize Ukraine, make Ukraine unable to repel a future Russian invasion. However, beneath this comport of post-truth justification, Putin's two real purposes were first regime security and second a mystically ordained bit of imperialist escalation. He wanted to deliver a blow to the West and in a single swoop propel Russia from the back row to the front row of nations. Now we are 3 years into Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and Western leaders are asking, how do we stop this thing? How do we bring an end to this war? And they're running into an obstacle, and that's the question of whether Putin actually wants to negotiate. And Putin has two incompatible instincts about this, the main one of which is that he is very interested in the process of negotiations, but a lot less interested in seriously negotiating. As the expert Sam Green puts it, Putin wants negotiations without wanting to negotiate. He wants to use negotiations as a tool for winning the war, as a tool to sow confusion, isolate Ukraine diplomatically, make life in Ukraine's domestic politics harder. Putting all of this together, he is after Ukraine's ungovernability. And this is not new behavior for Putin. Somewhat similarly, before the full-scale invasion, he issued an ultimatum to the West, which was a sham request for negotiations on the basis of an impossible request, which Putin knew to be impossible because its implication was essentially the dissolution of NATO. Now, at this point, Trump comes in and he says, look, Vladimir, you are ruining the Russian economy with this war. Now, the problem with this gambit by Trump is that Putin doesn't share the perspective that Russia is, in relative terms, doing badly in the war. Putin thinks that Russia has more stamina than Ukraine and the West, more manpower than Ukraine and the West, and that Russia's economic crisis can be managed by a series of totalitarian turns which Putin can take when needed. Putin realizes that the West has infinitely greater military and financial potential than Russia, but he believes the West can't convert that into effective strategy on the foreign policy stage, because it's suffering from democratic decline, as we might agree that it is, or as Putin sees it, hyperbolically, as suffering from imminent democratic collapse within the next 5 years. So what this means is that Putin's first instinct is to use negotiations, not to negotiate, but to win the war. But he has a second instinct, which is actually about being genuinely open to negotiations on one condition. And that is, if there can be a deal that destabilizes Ukraine's domestic politics more than no deal would. He's stuck between two instincts. The first instinct says exploit negotiations without actually seeking peace. And the second instinct says secure a deal that destabilizes Ukraine politically. And that's a dilemma for Putin, because he wants to make Ukraine ungovernable, but he is scared that what might seem to him to be a more toxic scenario for Ukraine under the condition of a deal may actually prove to be more conducive to stability than Putin imagines. And that's why thinking this through and the uncertainty of it is, in my analysis, a very big headache for Putin. Now, before we delve deeper into these tensions and how they could blow up for Putin and how Putin's afraid they could blow up for Putin, we have to look at the 6 key factors that experts believe may be causing Putin a headache around negotiations and see whether any of them apply. So Kursk as a potential fright for Putin in a conversation about negotiations. In his head, Kursk is about two things: self-respect and radical disinterest in Russia's borders and in the fate of the Russian people. So self-respect is, I am this imperial gatherer of lands, and yet Ukraine has a little bit of the Kursk region. I don't like this. But then this is outweighed by that spectacular disinterest in borders and spectacular disinterest in what happens in Kursk. If Putin needed to Mariupol Kursk, he'd Mariupol Kursk. So what that means is that ceding Russian territory in general for Putin, because of the borderlessness of his conception of his gathering of lands, it's a bit like a football manager ceding possession. Well, it doesn't matter because I'm interested in maybe the possession stat at the end of the match or at the end of the season, and even more so in the results. So that explains that kind of spectacular disinterest in Kursk, spectacular calm about it, unless it directly threatens Putin's stay in power. Kursk isn't a big headache for Putin when it comes to negotiations, and his hope is that he can just make a trade of Kursk for a little bit of territory that's proper Ukrainian and solve that issue for himself. But what about the second possible headache for Putin, which is that it looks like control over Ukraine territorially or even politically looks far out of reach for himself? Isn't that a disaster that he's worried about? And the answer is no. And that's because Ukraine is for Putin an instrument that he has obsessively and fetishistically chosen to destabilize the West and hopefully render the West utterly inept as a force that is able to act collectively and strategically. Putin doesn't care whether he destabilizes the West by getting Ukraine, or whether he gets Ukraine by destabilizing the West by other means. Even if he can't ever conquer the capital of Ukraine territorially, and even if he can't get political control over Ukraine, he hopes that by other means destabilizing the West might get him Ukraine anyway, or that the West will do enough to destabilize itself and just fold, and then getting a degree of control over Ukraine politically will not be as difficult for him as it would be in a world in which the West is a bit more functionally competent. So understanding that it's an instrumental fetish and that it's not Putin's only way to get his biggest strategic result, and that if he gets his biggest strategic result, he'll anyway think that it'll be then easier to get political control over Ukraine. But isn't Putin mortified about the prospect of Ukraine being in NATO? And the answer is yes, he would be if he thought that were realistic. Any end of the war in the near term would require a partition of Ukraine. But Ukraine could accept the de facto control over its territory by the Russian occupation without accepting the legitimacy of that control. If Ukraine accepted Russian occupation as legitimate, it would cause an unfathomable political self-immolation at home. Ukraine's governability would collapse. It could never agree to that. But it could agree to the Russians de facto controlling a bit of Ukrainian territory. Now, the rest of Ukraine being in NATO would still be utterly terrifying for Putin. The reason he isn't terrified is just because he doesn't think that Trump wants this, and two, if that's what's on the table for Putin, he'll just say no thanks and I'll carry on the war into 2026 instead. So his level of fear of this scenario is extreme. Its level of unacceptability to him is extreme, but he's relaxed about it because he doesn't think there's a realistic prospect of it. But what about number 4? Isn't Putin really concerned about Western but non-American troops on Ukrainian territory and meaningful Western security guarantees for Ukraine? And the answer is yes, Putin is extremely concerned and fearful about this. His hope is that Europe makes the wrong decision on this. His hope is that Europe decides that it doesn't want to, or that it can't offer security guarantees to Ukraine, and that therefore Ukraine's security will have to be guaranteed simply by the strength of the Ukrainian military with support from the West. Putin is waiting to see what happens, but any security guarantees from the West to Ukraine that are meaningful is genuinely a deep concern for him today. Number 5, isn't Putin going to be freaking out about the Russian language in Ukraine? And the answer is that there are elements of yes, but that the main answer is no. The two elements of yes are, first, that Putin wants to keep on insisting on domestic laws in Ukraine being the laws that he wants, because he is after Ukraine's ungovernability. He wants Ukrainian politics to become destabilized. There is also something else, another element of yes, and that is Putin's quite sickening fetishism about Ukraine. Putin really is the guy, when it comes to Ukraine, who lies in bed wondering if his neighbors are using their knives and forks in exactly the right way. And he'll be looking through the window and checking, and then freaking out and tossing and turning in bed if he thinks they're using their knives and forks not in the right way. So that's there too, as is the desire to undermine Ukraine's governability. But in the end, he thinks that if he controls a portion of Ukrainian territory where historically there are majority Russian speakers, that's enough for him. That is an act of liberation from Putin's point of view that alleviates his concern about the Russian language in Ukraine to a considerable degree. Now, in reality, we have to say that this is no liberation at all. It's the opposite. The Russians are practicing an apartheid military occupation of a very unlovely kind on Ukrainian territory that they've stolen. Number 6, isn't Putin really worried about the strength of the Ukrainian military into the future? And the answer here is yes. And that's why he will push strongly for demilitarization of Ukraine to a level that is commensurate with Ukraine being insufficiently defended from a potential future Russian invasion. Here Putin is worried because he knows he can't get what he is going to ask for. He will not get a level of demilitarization in Ukraine that makes Ukraine, as it were, vulnerable to a second full-scale reinvasion in the future. Putin is worried, but he also knows he can't really get what he wants. And now we get to the crux of our conversation, point 7, which is what Putin is really scared of about negotiations. He isn't scared of getting outsmarted by Trump or Zelensky. He is scared of making an historical mistake. And he is straining his mind at the limit because he has a crisis of confidence about this, about making an error of judgment he can't afford to make. Putin believes that only two voices matter. And that's not Trump or Zelensky. He might be dealing with them, but the only real voices that matter are two: Putin's own and the voice of history. Now you might ask, is Putin mad if he's talking to himself and talking to history? And I think the answer should be that we'd be mad to discount just how radically decades of unchecked, informalized, and vast power corrupt a tyrant into amazing levels of self-absorption and self-aggrandizement. Putin is not mad, and how he pursues his goals is rigorously rational. But his goals and the why behind his goals are so inflected by self-absorption and self-aggrandizement that they do hover on the brink of madness. Putin's main goal in negotiations isn't how do I outsmart Trump or Zelensky, it's what does history need me to do now? He sees himself alongside Peter the Great and Catherine the Great and Alexander III as a man through whom history speaks. And that's why nobody else in the room really matters to him. So Putin's biggest fear practically is tricking himself into a deal that looks good but actually undermines his strategic goals. A deal that looks like it will systematically destabilize Ukraine more than carrying on the war will, but ends up doing the opposite. A deal that gets him further away rather than closer to Ukraine's ungovernability. Putin's real enemy, as he sees it, is not Trump or Zelensky, but his own flawed judgment under conditions of extreme stress. And the West's strategy should be to take advantage of this, to persuade Putin that stopping the war on certain terms will be more disastrous for Ukraine than it actually will be, to push Putin into strengthening Ukraine while he thinks he's weakening it. Now, Putin wasn't always like this. And to understand how he got from being in his first term a corrupt autocrat to being a tyrant who floats above history and geography, watch this video next.